Good evening, everybody. The point about the urban motorway which never got built, it's a bit sad. One of the things that many of you are probably are planners by education is, you know, at the end of your career, can you turn around and say, is demonstrably the world a better place than it was when you started? Well, obviously I haven't got an urban motorway to show for my travels perhaps just as well. In fact, there, believe it or not, I don't know if it's still there, I think there's 200 yards of bus lane in Camberwell Green in South London, which I think is the only physical artefact I can point to, which has actually really been there but for me. But I don't think that, I don't know whether that justifies a lifetime, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here to speak this evening. It's lovely to see everybody here. My title, Traffic in Towns 50 Years On, is a deliberate double entendre. It refers first of all to the fact that we're now 50 years on from the publication of Traffic in Towns, otherwise known as the Buchanan Report, after its principal author, Colin Buchanan. Although in fact, I'm slightly sneaky because the actual anniversary is until next year, 1963, it was actually published, but we'll go around. I think, subject to all the very kind things that you said about my book, but I think Traffic in Towns is almost certainly the most widely read and well-known book on urban transport planning in Britain, and it's certainly its publication at the time contributed enormously to the character of the academic and professional discipline as we know it today. It was very significant to me. I think it was, if not the first book, one of the first books I bought as an undergraduate student at Newcastle. That tells you how much time has elapsed since. The defining characteristic of the Traffic in Towns report is the relationship between travel and traffic on the one hand and land use and environment on the other, as distinct from the separate fields of highway engineering and town planning which preceded it. The second intended meaning of my title, and my second objective, is to take stock of where we are in 2012 and to consider, rather like the Buchanan team did, what approach to urban transport planning might be appropriate in the next 50 years. Now this, I guess you're ready to admit, it's a pretty immodest aspiration. But in the process, I will hopefully offer some comments which I hope will provoke some interesting discussion, and I hope you have some time afterwards, if you're not going to dash off to get your drink or whatever, to discuss some of the issues. Now the sharper-minded amongst you will have noticed that my title is Traffic and Towns, not Traffic in Towns. And that is one of the key differences that I'll be seeking to explore later. Finally, by way of introduction, can I say that delighted as I am to come to Cardiff in South Wales, it's self-evident that I don't come from these parts, I almost certainly know less about them than anybody here else in the room. But rather than play safe by only talking in generalities, or maybe only quoting places that I know about and you don't, I decided that I've been very risky and I'm going to relate some of my comments to the Cardiff region. And as it happens, coincidentally, Cardiff was one of the places which, after publication of the Traffic in Towns report, the team that worked on that report set up as a consultancy and went around and in fact did a number of similar, applying their approach to a number of cities in the country, Cardiff being one, and I should be referring to that. Some of you who are as long in the tooth as I am may have been around when that was actually published. So it's particularly apt, I think, that I'm speaking on this subject in this city this evening. As well, in addition, learning more about the area, I'm absolutely indebted to other published material, much of it written by members of this university, which I enjoyed reading very much, and for which many thanks. However, if my understanding is wayward, as is almost certainly the case, just tactfully put me right later. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk about the 50 years since the Traffic in Town report, and I'm going to say something about each of the following. The context in which the Traffic in Town report was written, the content of the report and the planning approach that it recommended, the spatial perspective that was adopted in the report, and the response to the report's recommendations and consequential outcomes in the period since. So, dealing first with the context, it's always important, I think, and one of the key things that's in my book, and I try to do when I'm talking to students, it's very difficult for people who, maybe like you in the audience, who perhaps have only been around the last 20, 25 years, to appreciate the extent to which things have changed and also the extent to which things in the past kind of rebound into the present. So I wanted to just flag up just what, as well as actually reviewing what the report said recommended, it's necessary to try and think back into what life and values and so on was like at that time. And one of the ways to just highlight it, I mean, the notions of urban transport planning didn't exist really before the Second World War, but you had a situation, and then of course where traffic levels are a fraction of what they are now, but you had a situation where, for example, 4,500 pedestrians were killed on the roads each year. Pedestrians, almost by definition, predominantly in urban areas. So with their own, that's 10 times as many as there are today, but with only a fraction of today's traffic. So it's important to think that we're not just talking about congestion here or about pollution or whatever, but something as fundamental as safety was much more of an issue back at that time. Now originally people thought that urban traffic problems could be resolved by building bypasses and so on. It could traffic out, but of course one of the key things that Buchanan Report did was to identify the relationship between transport and land use and identify that that was in fact from the urban land uses themselves that much of the traffic was generated. In the 1950s, as consumers' prosperity began to rise for a period of almost 20 years since previously, the accompanying additional traffic, particularly in London, began to take on positively threatening proportions. And it evoked heightened but ambivalent emotions, which is captured in this is Geoffrey Crowther, who actually was chairman of the steering group over the Buchanan Report. He wrote what amounts to a foreword on there. And if you look at the language, it's possible to spend any time on the study of future traffic in towns without at once being appalled by the magnitude of the emergency that's coming upon us and inspired by the challenge that it represents. There's another fascination, and I think this is still with us to some extent. We are nourishing at immense cost a monster of great potential destructiveness, and yet we love him dearly. Regarded in its collective aspect as the traffic problem, the motor car is clearly a menace which can spoil our civilization. Translated into terms of a particular vehicle that stands in our garage or parked outside our door, we regard it as one of our most treasured possessions, or dearest ambitions. An immense convenience, an expander of the dimensions of life, an instrument of emancipation, a symbol of the modern age. So you have that absolutely, a very famous paragraph, which encapsulates the kind of awe, it's a combination of fear and awe, and but also excitement that the onset of mass car ownership evoked. Now the fear which this monster engendered was compounded by the fact that there was no systematic understanding of the problem and how to deal with it. Buchanan later commented that the highway engineers he worked with early in his career had what he described as a hydraulic approach. In other words, streets were regarded as analogous with drains, and if the flow threatened to become excessive, the response was simply to widen. The grim consequences of this approach were brought home to me when I went to work in West Yorkshire in the mid-1970s and discovered whole swathes of buildings fronting onto the main roads in the inner city, were effectively sterilised from improvement or redevelopment by widening lines established by a local Act of Parliament dated 1908. And if and when the Highway Authority eventually got round to found money to carry out the improvement, the required properties were already in a conveniently dilapidated state and could be bought and demolished cheaply, often leaving a scarred no man's land in its wake. That's the context in which you need to consider the people where the Buchanan Report was written. Highway engineers were not alone in having what we would now regard as a cavalier approach to the worth of buildings and the well-being of their occupants. The town planning profession, urged on by central government, was preoccupied with urban renewal, comprehensive development, and particularly in town centres, what it labelled, word still conveniently used, modernisation. You may kind of recognise Queen Street on the left. I think it might be the early 1950s, so he's got a better guess than me. There's remarkably little traffic around. I think it's probably still in the days of petrol ration. Either that's on a Sunday morning. But here you have the contrast between the traditional high street and on the right here, Birmingham Bullring, UK's first indoor shopping centre, a product of comprehensive redevelopment, indoor shopping centres, segregated car parks, and all that, and you name it. Probably we're not very familiar with it. And of course, I like the colour tones of the picture on the right. It sort of nicely evokes the mood of the time. So the left is all, past it stuff. The right is the future. Now, how the Traffic Count Report came to be written is a very interesting example. Those of you who are interested in policy, why do things happen the way they do in policy terms? It obviously isn't like maybe it's cracked up to it. And Traffic Towns Report is a very interesting example because Colin Buchanan originally worked as an engineer, but took a planning qualification and landed up working in the civil service, conducting what he found to be very boring assignments, doing inquiries into slum clearance orders. And in his spare time, he was interested in the motor car and what it presented, and he wrote his own book titled The Motor Car in Britain, A Mixed Blessing. And that was published in 1957. And by his own account, this attracted very little public interest from either the Department of Transport or the Department of Housing and Local Government. But his luck changed when the new Minister of Transport, Ernest Marple, was appointed in 1959, and he was going on, he was interested to tackle this growing problem as he perceived it, particularly in London, of urban congestion, traffic congestion. So he was going on a trip to North America on the flight, and he said to his civil servants, could you give me anything that's been written on this subject in the last few years? I'll have a look at it on the plane. And Mixed Blessing was one of the things he was given, and he happened to took a fancy to that, and he said, who is this Buchanan guy? Get him in. And in fact, he was personally appointed by Marples to commission to a team and write a report. And one of the interesting things about it is that because he was working directly, not only had it got written at all, but he was working directly to a minister, and as such, bypassed the civil service, which almost certainly would have emasculated it. And it's not only the content, but actually, even now today, the style, the way it's written, is a model example in terms of intelligibility and the graphics and the layout and the approachability. In fact, so much so that it was actually published, although this was a technical book from government, it was actually taken up and published by Penguin as a paperback and sold tens of thousands of copies. So it was not only the subject which inspired people, but also the manner in which it had been approached and presented in this report. In terms of reference, we're to study the long-term development of roads and traffic in urban areas and their influence on the urban environment. Turning now to the content of the report, the basis of it were projections of vehicle ownership, and in 1960, somewhere, in there on the graph, we're still only about 0.1 cars per person, And many people at the time were conveniently skeptical that we would never have mass car ownership. That in fact it would not be something that the working classes, for example, would ever have, or indeed that we would be foolish enough to follow the habits of the USA. But both Buchanan and Crowther wouldn't have any of that, and they were of the opinion that as income rose, so the people who could afford to own a car would do so, and that by 2010 we were approaching what would be expected to be somewhere near saturation at 0.44 cars per person, equivalent, as they rather quaintly put it, to 1.3 cars per family. And that implied something like a threefold increase in the number of cars. Well, what to do about the potential traffic consequences of that? Although there were ways in which that demand might be limited, both Buchanan and Crowther were of the view that in a situation where the majority of voters would become members of car-owning households, it would not be politically realistic to adopt limitation as a starting point. Pretty important proposition, I think. Buchanan also made the point, fairly, perhaps a little too easily. He said it would not be sensible to go on investing apparently unlimited sums in the purchase and running of motor vehicles without investing equivalent sums in the proper accommodation of the traffic that results. At the time, and I think probably more true today, private investment in vertical vehicles was running about 9 or 10 times higher than public investment in the system. And that is, in purely sort of transport operational terms, that is a nonsense. But that is what existed then and still exists now. So to explore what might be possible, the Traffic and Towns team carried out a series of case studies ranging from a small town, Newbury, a large town, Leeds, a historic town, Norwich, and a section of London's West End. And underpinning these studies was a set of principles which he labelled a working theory that is actually the core legacy of the report. The essence of the problem, they said, it was a matter of design, and specifically the relationship between land use and built form on the one hand and the provision for movement on the other. And this needed to be understood in two complementary ways. The first, which we might describe, I've already alluded to, is the functional connection, is the idea that traffic out there is not running around just on it for its own sake. It is a product of the land use activities which generate and attract those trips. I was only teaching in Brookes this morning and saying that's precisely, you cannot, as town planners, plan development and say, oh, transport people come along and sort out the traffic, transport implications. It is fundamental that you have to incorporate the transport implications in any considering of spatial land use development because of the functional relationship. And of course the logic is that the capacity of the transport system, if nothing else, physical capacity, can be related to the capacity, the propensity of the land use pattern to generate travel. The second dimension, which we might label the physical connection between land use and transport, is the manner in which buildings should be designed and managed. And Buchanan maintained that the source of so many problems in traditional cities was the traditional street layout, which intermixed the conflicting activities of traffic movement and servicing of vehicles on the one hand with the needs of pedestrians and building occupants on the other. And in essence, beyond streets which only had an immediate access function, he believed the two should be segregated. And he used the analogy of the separation of corridors and rooms within large buildings. He used a hospital as an analogy. He said you don't start wheeling trolleys through the operating theatres. The rooms of the hospital are separated from the corridors. I say that, I'm not sure in these straitened days where actually maybe the NHS has to do that kind of thing. So he came up with this principle of this wasn't actually new, the principle of a hierarchy of distributed roads, but the key thing was that they should be planned and managed to serve the needs of of traffic, moving traffic, and they would enclose what he labelled environmental areas, which were the cells within that network, wherein the interests of people living and working there, although there will be some traffic immediately accessing those buildings, but basically they would be the equivalent of what we would now call home zones. And that's a very important principle. And the principle can be applied either from scratch in the case of new settlements, or via the adaptation of existing urban areas. And a version of the new settlements would be very soon after was the famous, perhaps infamous, grid network of Milton Keynes. If you've never been or looked at a map of Milton Keynes, it looks like that. And like or loathe its character as an urban environment, I think it's incontrovertibly better in traffic and in Buchanan's environmental terms than any traditional city of comparable size, and that of course was its intention. As far as existing urban areas are concerned, Buchanan believed that the application of environmental standards, which he was very keen to promote, would determine the level of traffic could be possible to accommodate. And he anticipated what he called environmental traffic management, we would now think more in terms of traffic calming, in order to reduce both in volume and character the amount of traffic in the area to the levels of which, when you're talking about noise or pollution or freedom of pedestrian movement, it was represented what he would regard as a civilized living environment. And he linked the three variables: environmental standards, motorised accessibility, and the cost of prospective physical alteration to achieve his desired structure in the form of what he termed a rough and ready law, was known as Buchanan's law. So within any urban area as it stands, the establishment of environmental standards automatically determines the motorised accessibility, but in other words, the level that can be permitted, if you like, and retain those standards, but that level of accessibility can be increased according to the amount of money to be spent on physical alteration. In other words, to change the traditional layout of an urban area into one by a combination of managing the physical alterations that represented more his ideal. And he didn't balk from saying in plain words that this means that if it's indeed desired to have a great deal of traffic in urban areas in decent conditions, it's likely to cost a great deal of money to make the necessary alterations. And in fact, he explored what was involved in the case study of Leeds. This is a city rather bigger than Cardiff, about 500,000 population at the time. They anticipated that a primary network totaling 70 miles, mostly built to motorway standard, would be needed. And that highway building alone was estimated to cost £90 million, which at the time was twice the sum then being spent on major urban roads in the whole of the UK. And even that network was only expected to meet 40% of the maximum demand for commuting to the city centre. And similar conclusions, on an only slightly lesser scale, were arrived at here in Cardiff when Buchanan Co. did their report a few years later. In fact, in more densely developed areas, typically the centres of the larger cities, it was recognised that physical segregation on a horizontal plane alone would be insufficient to cope with likely traffic demands, and Buchanan therefore proposed vertical segregation in the context of comprehensive development. And that's where the iconic original picture I mentioned came from. And this would require, he claimed, a synthesis of skills to achieve intricate design, which he called traffic architecture. He said that to bring such an approach into being, we'd need an almost a revolutionary approach to questions of land ownership and development procedure. But we're certified there's nothing fantastic about the design itself. It illustrates vividly the awkward truth that the motor vehicle is really demanding a radically new urban form. So I mentioned the fact that the case study leads even with maximum physical redevelopment. In fact, it gets beyond the point beyond which, in serving something like a city centre, the scale of the road network and the design needed, if you're going to attempt to cater for full motorisation, is such that you actually land up obliterating the city centre. So that's one of the reasons, apart from anything else, purely physical practicability. And that's where it lets you start going wholly into a debt solution, and this actually what was proposed, I think, for Tottenham Court Road in London. So what's concluded was that even only catering for a proportion of the potential demand to apply the combination of difficult and costly reconstruction, plus the maintenance of an attractive public transport system, probably something like places like Leeds and Cardiff, half of all trips were still expected to be made by public transport, plus comprehensive control of car parking in order to act as the restraint mechanism in order to match supply and demand. Okay, so that's the content. The spatial perspective. Given the enormous costs implied and the disruption involved in the remodelling of existing urban areas, it's interesting to explore why this particular direction of change is recommended. After all, as Buchanan acknowledged, if we were to acquire motor vehicles in large numbers, and their natural consequence was the lower density dispersed urban forms already evident in the New World, then why not go with the flow and plan for future development in this fashion? Well, he argued that this is where it gets quite almost like emotional. He talked about the special importance of the countryside to the British people, and that they would not believe, he didn't believe they were prepared to see a large part of it sacrificed in order to allow for major dispersal of urban areas to accommodate motor traffic. He was fearful of urban sprawl, which is a widely held concern at that time. In fact, with great prescience, he expanded the virtues of compactness of urban areas, not because of its minimisation of travel distances, but because he thought proximity contributed to the variety and richness of urban life. And his enthusiasm for remodelling urban areas but retaining their compact form in the UK was in fact a direct counterattack against the prospect of endless low-density suburbia of the kind he witnessed in the United States. In fact, raising the spectre of sprawl was a bit disingenuous, since, as the director of the TCPA pointed out at the time, there was the perfectly good option of accommodating population growth in freestanding, discrete new towns. And in fact, Buchanan effectively acknowledged this in the Cardiff study, because one of the options he evaluated was a new town at Llantrison, in the northwest of Cardiff city. However, it was unrealistic to imagine small and medium-sized towns, whether old or new, would function as self-contained entities, and it was already clear that movements across urban boundaries were assuming increasing significance. And this is due to two factors working to different degrees in different parts of the country, and it's very evident in South Wales. So on the one hand, you have residential dispersal or overspill from the principal city outwards to smaller towns and rural areas in their hinterlands. And on the other hand, on the other side, you have a redistributed employment from rural areas and small towns, particularly like in South Wales, where based on the former coal and steel industries, to larger towns and cities, which were, as in Cardiff's case, acquiring a disproportionate share of jobs in the growing service sector. So these two in combination, coupled with growing mobility through car ownership and investment into the inter-urban road network, result in increasingly extensive patterns of day-to-day travel between towns rather than simply within them. And significantly, the appropriate relationship between land use and transport at this wider spatial scale, what we would now class as a functional urban region, did not figure in Buchanan's deliberations. And given the conditions of the time, it's perhaps understandable that he stuck to a literal physical interpretation of his brief, in other words, to study traffic in towns, but as a result, unfortunately overlooked the very places where the greatest growth in traffic would actually occur. Finally, in this first part, the response since publication. In fact, the report met with enormous professional and public interest. Buchanan said it was beyond his wildest dreams. It was commended, if you read the leaders at the time, and the newspapers at the time, it was commended as being lucid and visionary, bravely inviting politicians and the public to confront the implications of mass car ownership and to do so in the prevailing spirit of modernisation. And in fact, rather cleverly, because Buchanan's law, because he casts his recommendations not in terms of some fixed outcome, but rather in terms of set of principles and in terms of choice as between these related variables, he in fact won support across the spectrum of opinion. At one extreme, highway engineers claimed that his analysis legitimised the road building plans they'd always had. On the other hand, on the other extreme, there were fledgling conservation, environmental groups who saw his groundbreaking attention to environmental issues, land use and build form, as a way precisely of confronting those self-same highway plans. The Minister Marple's welcomed the report's general approach, but as is often the way, mindful of its financial implications, was notably a bit less rapturous than everybody else, given what I've been saying about the financial implications. And he got around the difficult business, as is often the case. If you can't actually do anything, what do? You set up more research, you have more studies. So in fact, instead of funding the actual infrastructure, they funded studies to say exactly how much in each of the main towns and conurbations, Cardiff being one, those studies, and they, as were put off for a few years, actually confronting the central issue. Meanwhile, most of the government money went into the interurban motorway system, which was, of course, was encouraging the counter-urbanisation process. One important byproduct of traffic in towns, it's interesting how these, this is another kind of accident, a very important one, was it led the following Labour government, post-1964, to reject certain elements of the recommendations of the Buchanan Report on the reshaping of the railways, which was published at around the same time. Proposals to close many of the loss-making passenger services in the conurbations were refused, and a new system of national subsidy introduced to enable them to continue to operate. And the valley lines of South Wales were one of a group of such services whose survival to the present day has been dependent on that innovation, and which for the first time recognised the value of an independent transport mode as part of a wider urban planning strategy in conurbations. And indeed the PTE, which I worked for, one of the PTEs in West Yorkshire, was another one of the products at the time, the recognition that there was a need for what we now label as integrated transport planning across the conurbation. Well, by the time the new studies had been carried out and serious attention started to be given to urban highway networks at about the beginning of the 1970s, the climate of opinion surrounding large-scale development in general and urban motorways in particular, going back to my South Circular study, had changed radically. And the excitement of modernisation portrayed in futuristic images had been overtaken by the grimness of physical reality. And schemes whose gestation preceded the Buchanan Report, this is London's Westway, in construction around about 1969. That was actually first planned, the line drawn on the map, in 1911. And it was done, no reference to traffic architecture or any nonsense like that. It was actually designed, there were some famous photographs, unfortunately I couldn't find it, where this is, as you may know, this is an elevated motorway of about 3 miles, and when it was first built, because they only took the property, they immediately needed to build the road itself, people could stand, and as a stunt, you could stand on the hard shoulder of that elevated motorway and shake hands with people leading out of the bedrooms of the houses alongside. So, you know, that was not what Buchanan had in mind, but that was where practice was at that time, and understandably, that caused enormous furore and virtually put the boot into any such thing. And interestingly, local residents obviously began to campaign against impending destruction of their neighbourhoods, and here in Cardiff, most famously in connection with the so-called Hook Road scheme through Cathays, which in fact is a short walk across the back here. And for all I know, some of the older members of the audience may have been out there with the banners at the time. But this in fact was a key part of, this was Buchanan and Co.'s proposed primary network, slightly smaller scale than Leeds, it was probably 40-50 miles of motorway standard road, of which this here was the central primary we're talking about here. This was the new central to the proposals. It wasn't the only one that hasn't materialised, most of them indeed haven't. There was, I mean, notwithstanding the controversy surrounded by individual schemes, there's a more fundamental difficulty concerning implementation, which is, even if you thought in principle this is right, how do you bring about this kind of transformation of an area whilst people are still living in it, when the short-term costs of destruction of what is often sound housing and total destruction of neighbourhoods, the short-term and hence the political costs are all too apparent, and the long-term benefits, i.e. of a completed road network and completely remodeled network, are out there sometime in the future. And that question of how do you get from here to there, the question of the implementation, is not something that the Buchanan Report looked at. To be fair, when I did my planning courses at that sort of time, nobody thought about these things either. They were only concerned with doing the kind of design year solution, right, and how you actually got there. But that actually proved to be the fatal flaw, even if you think that the end product was right. The process proved to be flawed. So the primary network proposals for Cardiff were abandoned in the mid-70s, and the same fate typically befell other cities. And by comparison with Buchanan's long-term vision, the carefully executed studies, this city here in Cardiff elsewhere, I think it's been characterised by, well, I'm sure even its friends would term prolonged muddling through. And in fact, what has actually happened, the transition to mass car ownership, has involved almost a continual juggling exercise, managing finite road and parking space in the face of increasing use with limited resources, extreme sensitivities of residents on the one hand, and on the other side, the same people but wearing, as it were, a different hat, being, as they typically are, the average motorist, bloody minded about their God-given right to drive just about anywhere, wherever they please. And how you balance that is obviously a huge conundrum. However, the two innovations I highlighted, that's the functional connection between land use and transport and the hierarchical treatment of distributed roads, have been central to planning practice over the last half-century, and in a way that although the widespread physical restructuring, although there are obviously individual local examples, has not. And interesting, probably the most significant departure from the received wisdom has occurred in the last 10 or 15 years, challenging the principles of the rigidities of segregation with introducing the concepts of shared space, traffic calming, and so on. Although I think this revolution in street management is still actually in its infancy. Today I think Buchanan would be appalled at the choices we elected to make have left us 50 years on with such obviously substandard traffic and environmental conditions. And an autobiography he wrote in 1993 said, "I told you so, and you can see why." Amazingly, the number of cars per head today is almost exactly what he predicted, for slightly different reasons. But he, I think, must have been aghast at our collective willingness to continue to pursue the chimera of a free lunch. In other words, this point that I made previously, that we can privately invest in all those vehicles without actually either catering for them explicitly or providing the alternatives which people who have the option of car use will be prepared to use. Okay, so move on now to the second part of my talk, about 50 years from now, when I want to look briefly at what's similar about the situation today and what are the differences. And since it's a very long time since the Buchanan Report, it's perhaps surprising to think that there are similarities with the early 60s at all. However, the basic proposition underlying the Traffic and Towns Report, the one I referred to, that the motor car is an extremely attractive commodity to the individual, and that most people would choose to own one if they can afford it, that remains essentially sound. And although the appearance of cars has changed over the last 50 years, nobody has yet come up with a convincing alternative form of individual mobility. There are one or two concepts, like the personalised helicopter on the right there. And perhaps if they did, if we all went round with one of those instead, that might create its own set of problems. One potential alternative to car use and travel which has emerged since the 1960s is particularly more recently, is the revolution in telecommunication and information technology. And although it's often posited that this is going to have a dramatic effect on travel, wasn't previously, it's not clear that it's a net effect as a reduction in travel overall. There are typically swings and roundabouts. As I discovered when I did program household surveys last summer, surveying places I'd gone to when they were built 20 years previously, I mean, most people's lives remains tied to the day-to-day rhythm of going to work, getting children to school, going to the shops, and so on. It's pretty mundane. And if we were about to transmute to a nation of individuals running our lives wholly from a digitally connected pod, I think there will be more evidence of consequential travel reduction than there is. And presumably if you're prepared to do that, I wouldn't bother to come down here tonight, and you wouldn't bother to come here either, and we could just sit in front of a screen and talk to each other. So the basic conundrum which Buchanan was asked to address, the prospective increase in car use and its implications, is still with us. I noted, for example, in a recent public opinion survey in Cardiff, 50% of respondents considered that there are, quote, serious or very serious problems with travel and transport in the city, and that, surprise, surprise, congestion is rated as the #1 problem. So whatever advances we've made in urban transport in the last half century, and there have been improvements, particularly things like pedestrianisation in inner urban areas, cracking the fundamental mismatch between the supply and demand for car use is not one of them. And the present situation, assuming eventually we re-enter an era of economic growth, is almost certainly going to get worse. These are forecasts made using the Department of Transport's national travel model for England for the next 25 years. Sorry, not for England, these are for large towns in England. I have no reason to believe that Cardiff is fundamentally different. And they envisage all traffic growing by about 40% over those 25 years. And congestion, they lay by 70%. These are central estimates, there's also potential variation around them. In Cardiff, for example, over the period to 2035, the number of cars is forecast to increase by 36%, which is twice the increase in the rate of population, reflecting the fact there is still considerable scope for greater car ownership amongst middle and lower income groups. So in all that I've said so far, things are fundamentally not that different. But there are fundamental differences, and there are 4 things that I would like to highlight. About the availability price of oil, concerns over global warming, the transformation to cities and regions and its implications for connectivity, and the question about how we pay tax and pay for public services. When the Traffic and Towns Report was written in the 1960s, many of the world's main oil fields were still being opened up, and the possibility of us running out of fuel for internal combustion engines was a very distant prospect. In any case, there was a reasonable expectation that long before then, one of the various alternative fuels or forms of motive power recognised as theoretically feasible would have made its way into practical use. However, for example, the shift to electrification of motor vehicles, which has been hailed for many years, it's salutary that even with government grants of 5,000 per vehicle, the rate of electric vehicle ownership is only currently running at 1,500 vehicles per year, i.e. one vehicle in every 20,000. That is how far electrification has got thus far. So, as we approach peak oil and begin to look over the horizon seriously, well, the prospect is a great deal more worrying. Of course, we're not literally anticipating the pumps running dry, unless we have some horrendous geopolitical upheaval, but we can expect the price to rise faster than real incomes, and as it has done in the UK over the last decade. The situation becomes more critical as we seek to grapple with the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and as medium-term prospects for income growth in the UK continue to be revised down. And that's because the rising price of oil is determined by the global market, and that takes place independently of whether and when we actually manage to repair our economy in the UK. Now, the sensitivity of this particular issue and the difficulty it presents for households who claim they've got no choice but to rely on car use is evidenced by the clamour that surrounds the Chancellor's annual budget statement, when he's typically lambasted for seeking to raise fuel duty, even if only to keep pace with inflation. And just this week, you will have seen, in the spirit of never miss a political opportunity, then you can, Edmund Advan has been out there 2 days before the Corbyn by-election to propose that the fuel duty of 3p due next January is put off. You know, if you ever have extreme political opportunism, I mean, it's not unique to the Labour Party by any chance. All of them do it all the time, and there's no other fiscal measure which attracts that kind of attention. It's ludicrous as a way of how we handle it, but that's the reality we're in. So if that's the situation now, what happens is the future wise the economy remains in a febrile state, and as I said, the world economic position on oil is obviously can only go one way. And yet, there's been no serious attempt by either Labour or coalition governments to link the issue of oil, peak oil and fuel tax to the question of more sustainable transport planning strategy. In 2000, when Gordon Brown was challenged about fuel duty, then he said we needed to pay for schools and hospitals, which in one sense was true, but it missed the point that actually we also need to encourage people to become less car dependent. Second issue, global warming. This is an issue which of course wasn't even known about in the 1960s. Passenger cars currently contribute 58% of greenhouse gas emissions from domestic transport, which in turn is 20% of the total, so it's about 12% overall. And greater efficiency in fuel consumption of new cars is being promoted all the time through EU agreements. But the trouble is that the combined effect of all the measures that the government and the European Union are promoting is to do little more than to counter the effect of increasing traffic volumes, so that in the forecast for 2035, which I mentioned earlier, the emissions, CO2 emissions, are expected to fall by just 9%. That doesn't take us very far on the way to the projected statutory emission of 80% by 2050, if car transport is to contribute to that. So the logical response would be to say that in addition to the technological improvements in motoring, we all as individuals need to drive less. But this would imply much greater public investment in alternatives and in so-called behavioural change measures to get people to drivers actually to alter their habits. And this politically is a direction which no UK government has yet been brave enough to pursue with any great conviction. The present government's backing for rail investment perhaps being a reasonably honourable exception. Now, in policy terms, there's an important synergy between the two issues of peak oil and emissions reduction I've just mentioned. To the extent we reduce our dependence on conventional motor vehicles, the more we lessen our vulnerability individually and collectively to the impact of prospective oil price shocks. However, there's a critical spatial dimension to these issues. The majority of our trips, proportion of trips, are shown in green on the left, and you can see that something approaching 60% of motorised trips are less than 5 miles. But if you see in terms of carbon emissions on the right, that same category of trips only generate about 20% of the CO2. And the reverse is the case for medium and long distance trips. And what that means in practice, putting it into a local context, is to say that it is almost irrelevant what forms of transport are used for journeys made entirely within Cardiff or other towns and cities in South Wales. There are other desirable reasons why you might want to change it, but CO2 is not one of them. What really matters is the volume and mode of trips between these places and, of course, to other regions. And yet, paradoxically, on a per capita basis, car use is actually already lowest in the main towns, and it is reasonably to see how people might be persuaded to use their cars a little less and other modes a bit more, for journeys within towns. When you talk about journeys between towns, the more it becomes much more problematic, and the government at the moment, other than its support for rail as a general, but that only caters for a small proportion of potential origin destinations, there is no strategy in place to try and address that. So thirdly, the emergence of city regions. I noted earlier that interurban movements didn't form part of the brief for traffic in towns, but the changes that have taken place on the ground in Cardiff, as in other cities, demonstrate what's actually happening. The top line there is over 15 years, the fact that traffic across what is called the county cordon, but I think that's pretty much what is currently the Cardiff city cordon, increased by 39% over the 15 years to 2008. Whereas the cordon around the city centre, which is the green one at the bottom, actually fell by 14% in that period. So you had a significant rebalancing with the movements across from the city to the surrounding area growing very substantially. And in fact, I think about 40% of jobs in Cardiff are now held by people living outside, a daily inbound flow of some 74,000 commuters. In economic terms, the development of the rail network, which has been boosted by the government's announcements of electrification of the Valley lines, it reinforces the dominance of Cardiff within the wider sub-region, and I'm aware this is a highly controversial issue. It's been planning for many years. However, I believe what was the area's first statutory regional transport plan, published by SUTA, the Alliance of South East Wales Transport Authorities, in 2010, sought to address the wider issues, but given the region's complex settlement pattern, the desired spread of physical connectivity and accessibility for all social groups between all the places represents a very daunting challenge. I'm not sure whether the RTP was thought to lack vision, but it was notable that an aspirational plan for a South Wales metro was published a year later, commissioned by the Cardiff Business Partnership. It's since received support from SUTA, and the electrification I refer to is a critical first step in some of the radial elements of that plan. But filling in the regional network with either additional light rail or bus prioritise routes and park and ride and so on is a very expensive proposition. And significantly, for these elements, unlike the rail electrification, this will have to come from funding, Welsh funding, not UK funding, where it's Welsh national or Welsh local, not unlike the electrification, that's a UK-based funding. So looking to the future, we can see that the mobility challenge is now at the city region level, in terms of improving public transport connectivity, not in terms of accommodating private car movements within towns. Although the Metro proposal has some traffic and environmental implications, and one could apply Buchanan's law to it. In other words, if you want to achieve a level of accessibility, in this case by public transport, you've got to be prepared to fund it. But in fact, it's now rather than environment, it's now economic opportunity. If we were rewriting his law and the extent to which that economic opportunity is spread throughout the city region, which would be the way one would phrase it. So funding becomes the all-important issue. And this is the final thing on my looking at differences. At the time of traffic in towns, there was a prevailing presumption that whatever the costs of highway construction, they would be met out of general taxation. And road pricing as a means of restraint was acknowledged as a technical possibility, but there was no suggestion of linking the revenue streams from such schemes to funding the desired investments. That idea had to wait an initiative of the Conservative government in the early 90s concerned with private financing more generally. Unfortunately, in the case of transport, motorists are already subject to explicit taxation in the form of fuel and vehicle excise duties. And in my opinion, the New Labour government made a critical error in attempting, as it did 10, 12 years ago, to encourage local authorities to adopt road pricing strategies, including here in Cardiff, in the absence of a national scheme. Because the whole point about a national scheme is that charges that can be put on motorists in particular places at particular times can be offset by reductions in the generalised fuel duty or vehicle excise duty. You can argue about whether in balance it should be so fiscally neutral overall, but in principle, if you do it under a national scheme, you have the opportunity to balance these different elements out to achieve a more efficient and equitable outcome overall. If you try to do it as a local one-off scheme, you don't have that option. And of course, it was precisely that led to the very high-profile defeat in the referendum in Manchester in 2009 for a charging scheme there. And that appeared to put the hammer on the head for some such schemes, whether in South Wales or whatever. However, by another rather sort of quirk of situation, central government finds itself having to remedy the situation, but for rather different reasons. Because of the improvements in fuel economy of vehicles that I mentioned earlier, the revenue received by the Treasury from fuel duty is projected to fall significantly. And simply raising rates of duty to maintain revenue will be nigh on politically impossible. I mean, as I was saying, as much as we can maintain ones you've got already. And it would have very unwelcome distribution effects. So hence, almost by necessity, a revenue stream based wholly or partly on variable users charging will need to be introduced instead. And it's interesting that at the recent Lib Dem Party conference, Transport Minister Norman Baker was reported as saying that some form of pay-to-drive scheme was, quote, inevitable. Of course, even if he's right, this isn't going to happen overnight. However, there are contemporary issues surrounding tax and public spending more generally, which I think will effectively force public opinion in this particular direction. The prospect of prolonged austerity is forcing parties of all complexions to review much more critically the various categories of public expenditure. And serious debate is taking place on which services are currently provided publicly, can or should be provided privately, or otherwise involve some element of direct charge on their user. In the case of transport, it seems to me to be fundamentally inequitable, if nothing more, that often very expensive forms of road infrastructure are available free, are paid out of general taxation, but are available free at point of use to the motorists who use them, whereas bus services, for example, which are depended on particularly by the poorest and least mobile sections of the population, are for the most part operated commercially on a pay-as-you-go basis. Now, interestingly, for rather different reasons concerned with promoting infrastructure investment generally, David Cameron recently announced that the government is reconsidering the possibility of funding major road schemes partly or wholly on the basis of tolls. And thus far he's been careful, and I think politically astute, in confining such suggestions to wholly new schemes to try and allay fears amongst the motoring public. And this is just the pin of the edge. I think, in fact, those fears are very well founded, but I hope they're going to be surmounted nonetheless. In other words, I think that if direct charging for new schemes does become market transport landscape, I think certainly if the present government is around for very long, I think it will be almost inevitable. I think it's going to be seen as fundamentally illogical and inequitable, not just the business between road users and public transport users, but even amongst car motorists themselves, that by an accident of timing, if you happen to be in an area which hasn't had road investment in the past, if you have a new major facility in the future, you've got to be asked to pay for it, whereas people in other areas or other parts of the country which have received the same level of investment in the past will not have to pay for it. I don't see how that argument basically it may be very, well, Cameron seemed doing may be very practical, pragmatic in the short term, but I think ultimately it's fundamentally flawed, and it will in fact pave the way to a national system. So I think that it's, although the debate is currently taking place in the context of inter-urban road schemes, I think it's a relatively small step to treating urban road space in the same way. And I think the context is changing quite radically. And in the case of South Wales, for example, obviously I don't know the details of the present situation, I think opportunities may come available sooner than was thought previously. So, in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that in transport we're facing an era of transition no less significant than the one contemplated, though different in kind, than the one contemplated by the Traffic and Towns team 50 years ago. The challenge today is not how to accommodate prospective demands of the car owning population, but how to bring about a pattern of travel amongst that population which fulfills accessibility needs whilst being sustainable in economic, social and environmental terms. Fortunately, the policies from the spatial dimension, the policies of urban containment, which have characterised British town planning since its inception, mean that with only a few exceptions, the spatial patterning of development means that we inherit makes this a practical proposition. However, at a time economically when there's more than usual pressure, to capitalise on business opportunities wherever they present themselves, it will require vision and determination on the part of planning authorities to relate new developments that do occur to the sustainable travel patterns needed. So, in essence, the situation now is that in most situations personal car use needs to be reduced, and a more discriminating attitude promoted in which a car is valued as a premium mode to do the things that other modes can't, rather than a sort of first port of call kind of all-purpose workhorse. And from a planner's perspective, it's a moot point whether gaining acceptance for such a change in mind and action is more or less difficult than the traditional focus on physical change. I was thinking about this, it was easier in the past, as it were, to draw a physical design impression of the change that you wanted to see and hope people would buy into it. That is not where we're at now. Where we're at now is actually changing hearts and minds, not only in transport but around the world. So the planner's role is fundamentally different. This is Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man and rethinking art and science and so on, as a sort of conception of the framework in which we need to be thinking about things. However, I think articulating an appropriate vision for the future, although it's not a design vision, is one that planners need to make, although it would be a lot easier to do that if there were more supportive rhetoric coming from central government, of any political persuasion. One final lesson to be learned from the traffic in towns and the fate of the recommendations I referred to it about the process of planning itself. Critics observed that proposals were resisted because the people affected hadn't been adequately consulted and were not convinced that other possibilities had been investigated sufficiently. We have the advantage that we're not now tied to what then perceived necessity of agreeing long-term master plans for the future. However, we still need, it seems to me, to achieve a consensus on the trajectory of change that all the different measures involving myriads of stakeholders that are involved in changing minds and actions to more sustainable patterns of travel are needed. So in this field at least, I suggest the contribution of planners deserves not to be judged on the merits of their designs, very nice though they are, but on the strength and robustness of their discourse. And I hope in being here this evening, I've helped the department promote this discourse in this field. Thank you very much.